Time was once a steady river, unbroken, unquestioned, unchallenged. We lived in its quiet current, unaware that we stood beside a trembling waterfall of possibility, on the edge of something that would redefine everything we thought we knew about existence. What does it mean to walk backward through your own life? To touch yesterday? To see tomorrow before it arrives? And if we could, should we? In the half-light of human ambition, the idea of bending time from a dream into reality was not merely an invention. It was a reckoning. Before the possibility of time travel entered the world's imagination, life was governed by a rhythm as old as life itself: sunrise, work, sleep, and death. Village bells and factory whistles marked our hours. Children learned by the passing seasons, lovers by the changing moons, and farmers by the first frost. We measured our lives in heartbeats and harvests, in the slow erosion of mountains and the steady drift of stars. The air smelled of earth and smoke. The weight of each day was felt in calloused hands and furrowed brows. Time was both comfort and confinement, familiar, inexorable, and beyond meddling. Ancient people had myths of gods who could slip between ages, messengers who could wander realms of past and future. But those were stories, conjured by poets and priests. Time was sacred, untouchable, the domain of fate. Clocks and calendars were our closest attempt to grasp it. Mechanical hearts beating out our days. Scholars debated the nature of time like philosophers arguing over wind. It was abstract, intangible, a whisper more than a frontier. And then, in the frozen laboratories of the early 21st century, the first crack appeared. It began not with a triumphant proclamation but with a whisper of data. A flicker in a collider's readout that shouldn't have been there. In a subterranean complex shielded by concrete and secrecy. Physicists chasing. The fabric of reality stumbled upon a distortion, a fleeting bending of the temporal field, like a crease in a glued canvas. It was microscopic, unpredictable, and yet unmistakable. The discovery was buried in academic papers. Footnotes written in language so dense that only a handful in the world noticed. But for those few, it was the seed of revolution. What changed was not a single moment, but a succession of them. Collaborations between mathematicians and quantum theorists, engineers and dreamers. A vision took shape. Time was not a river but a tapestry. Threads woven together, accessible by technology that could decipher its patterns. It was the ambition of an era that believed nothing was beyond reach, that gravity, life, death, and now time itself could be coaxed into obedience. The world's attention was finally caught when the first public announcement was made. What had been theoretical might soon be practical. The engine of change was neither a machine nor a single genius. It was the collision of ideas fueled by competitive nations and private empires with vast fortunes. A generation raised on the myth of limitless progress poured resources into research that had once been the province of philosophers. Particle accelerators were repurposed, quantum computers deployed, and an entire new lexicon of temporal physics was born. Scientists spoke of Cronin fields and causal loops, of harnessing fluctuations in the quantum foam like a sailor tacking against the wind. Yet for all the brilliance, the explanations were never simple, nor were they meant to be. Time travel remained, even in theory, an unruly force. The first prototypes were less like graceful machines, and more like monstrous contraptions of metal, glass, and humming energy. They were born in basements and secret facilities, guarded by armed patrols and corporate lawyers, shrouded in patents that spanned continents. To the public, it was an absurdity, science fiction crowbarred into reality. To the few who labored in its creation, it was a burden of obsession, a belief that humanity's destiny lay not just forward, but backward and sideways through history. But nothing that touches the boundaries of human understanding is without cost. Behind the gleaming laboratories were workers whose hands ached from repetition, whose eyes strained in the glare of screens that promised transcendence, but delivered exhaustion. Young engineers slept in cramped dorms, their youth given over to equations, and pulses of code flickering in the blue glow of monitors. Families were fragmented. Spouses spoke in half-finished sentences. There were accidents, bright flashes in secluded test sites, unexplained discharges of energy that left scorched earth and unanswered questions. The press called them anomalies. But those closest knew them as casualties of ambition. In a small town near one of the earliest test facilities, Maria Vasquez waited for her husband, Adrian, who never came home. He was an engineer pulled into the project with promises of a future. Only he seemed to imagine. She kept his toolbox by the door, untouched, and lit a candle each night for his safe return. Her neighbors spoke in hushed tones. Talk of ghosts and restless time seemed less strange than the idea that her husband might be lost to a machine's caprice. Maria's story was one among many silent tragedies woven into the grand tapestry of progress. And yet, for all the human cost, something unprecedented emerged. Cities that once breathed with predictable rhythms began to pulse with new energy. The promise of time travel ignited industries, from tourism companies selling temporal history experiences to entertainment conglomerates, crafting narratives no scriptwriter had dreamed possible. Nations that had languished on the margins of power saw opportunity, hosting research hubs, bidding for temporal tourism rights, sponsoring institutes that promised first access to tomorrow. Wealth concentrated quickly in the hands of those who controlled the technology, deepening divides as access became a new currency. In the new world that took shape, some walked with heads held high, believing they were the architects of destiny. Others stared at horizons they no longer understood. Streets filled with glowing advertisements touting trips to witness ancient Rome at dusk, or to glimpse the architectural marvels of 2300 AD. Some of these experiences were simulations, carefully coded illusions. Others were closer to reality, regulated and limited, watched over by temporal stewards whose job it was to prevent paradox and chaos. Outside the gilded cores of wealth and privilege were places that time travel felt like an intrusion, a spectre haunting societies already struggling, economies tethered to natural resources collapsed as corporations siphoned interest from futures so rich they rendered present labor obsolete. Traditional education systems crumbled. What was worth learning when tomorrow's knowledge could be downloaded in an instant? Societies fractured between those who embraced temporal revolution and those who resisted, fearing loss of identity and autonomy. The event's ripple effect was not contained by borders or cultures. In distant continents, indigenous communities grappled with corporations seeking to extract temporal artifacts, data points, believed to reveal alternative pasts that might be moneized. Cities once vibrant with centuries-old heritage found themselves bargained like relics in a global marketplace that saw history as another product to be consumed. Whether on the steppes of Eurasia or the islands of the Pacific, the question became the same. At what cost do we claim mastery over time? Resistance emerged not just from economic disenfranchisement but from the human impulse to preserve meaning. Philosophers and thinkers, once marginalized, found new platforms in crowded forums and smoky lecture halls. They asked questions no algorithm could answer. What is the self when memory can be rewritten? What is truth when every moment can be revisited or revised? They formed movements that were both intellectual and visceral, challenging the notion that progress must equate to control. In the galleries of old universities, scholars recited verses that once celebrated the immutable march of time, now lamenting the price of second chances. The Chrono Ethics Council sprang to life, advocating for laws that would protect the integrity of history, to prevent exploitation of moments that belong to collective memory, rather than private gain. They spoke of legacy not as conquest but as stewardship, urging societies to re-examine their understanding of time as a resource rather than a refuge. The long-term legacy of humanity's flirtation with time travel persists in ways both visible and hidden. Children today learn history not from dusty textbooks but through curated temporal experiences, glimpses into reconstructed worlds that feel indistinguishably real. The environment, once battered by centuries of industrial neglect, now bears scars from hastily abandoned temporal research sites. Their once promised wonder now silent ruins, overrun with vines, and echoing the laughter of car keys and ticking clocks long still. In city centers, monolithic museums house relics from alternate timelines, objects that defy chronology, that should not exist yet do, whispering of possibilities once touched. And yet, for all the spectacle, there are those who mourn what was lost, a sense of mystery, the slow, organic unfolding of life that once grounded us in the here and now. In the end, perhaps the oldest truth remains. Time is not a line we traverse but the shadow of our own becoming. We chased mastery over it, seeking dominion over yesterday and tomorrow, believing that to command time was to conquer fate. But in that pursuit, we rediscovered something more profound and unsettling, that history doesn't disappear, it is reborn. And what we make of its echoes, its broken songs and fractured dreams, is the story not just of time, but of ourselves. History, after all, is not a backdrop to change. It is the pulse by which we measure our humanity, the lingering question that refuses to let us rest. And as long as we walk, we carry with us the weight of every moment we have lived, and every moment yet to come.